Welcome to Leaders and Legends, the podcast focused on leadership and clinical trial execution. I'm your host, Patty Lushton, CEO of Diligent Pharma. In each episode, we'll get to know the individuals who are driving change and influencing the direction of our industry. Whether you're a seasoned executive yourself, an emerging leader, or simply passionate about clinical trials like I am, join us as we discuss our industry's most pressing challenges, the future of clinical trials, and hear insights and advice from the leaders who are moving our industry forward. Deirdre, thank you so much for being part of Leaders and Legends. I've been really excited about this conversation.
I appreciate it, Patty. I'm honored. The leader part, I get. The legend might be a little much.
Come on. No, you're one of the legends too. You're both. But I was walking to work today, and I was trying to remember when we met, and it could have been when you were at Endo, when I was first starting the Quality Consortium. It was a very long time ago. And I don't know if you remember, but
I honestly don't, because I think it's been so long. It's one of those, haven't I always known you?
It feels that way.
Yeah.
But, I was I wanted to just reflect something back to you as a way to start our conversation. Whenever I would see you like on an executive panel at a conference, or I knew you were presenting, I would always make a point to attend your session. And part of the reason is that I feel like whenever you were sort of part of one of these industry conversations, I feel like I would always sort of walk away with either learning something new or kind of looking at an old issue in a new way based on your input. And I just wanted to start by asking, this combination that you have, which I think is experience plus authenticity, plus sometimes the, willingness to be a little vulnerable and also directness. It's kind of like I see that as your personal style. And I just wonder, do you see a correlation between sort of your style and authenticity and your career journey? And I know that's kind of maybe a tough question and maybe a tough way to start, but I've been thinking about that. And I actually had a conversation with Peyton Howell about, just energy and the importance of energy and what you bring to your work. And I see you as having kind of a distinct style, but I wondered, are you aware of it? And do you feel like it has impacted your leadership journey?
So first of all, thank you. That's fabulous feedback to hear. I really appreciate it. So yes, and I'd say on a number of those things. So am I aware of my style? Very much so. And certainly as I've grown in my career and personally, that becomes more and more, obvious to me that it is a style. But is it that differentiated? Is something people have often said to me, oh, it's different when you're in the room, or it's the way you deliver, etc.
Yes.
Which is just probably such a natural part of the way I communicate or I interact with people that I don't think of it as that distinct. But I can tell you that authenticity is always at the heart of it. I shy away from sort of corporate speak. I think the only way that we can really improve things that we're working on, like clinical trials or access to medicines, et cetera, is by having an authentic conversation. And I'd rather, if I'm going to stand at a podium, reveal as much as I can. And my personal vulnerability, it's what I can always gauge, right? I can go out there as much as I want. Company information is a whole different thing. But
Right.
where it's more about how I view the world or I've experienced the industry, yeah, I'd rather say, look, this is the reality of the experience. And the way you phrase it sort of also puts it into context for me that there's many of us who experience what gets labeled as imposter syndrome, or you think, I can't be that good or that different. I think it's leveraging that in a very different way. It's like, maybe somebody else feels that way. Let me tell you what our reality is. And if it helps somebody try something new, not be afraid to ask the question, be willing to take another sort of chance at something, then that's the impact I'd love to have.
Yeah. Well, it's very appreciated. And, and I think that unfortunately it's not common because there is sometimes sugarcoating or presenting things in a way that you kind of feel there's almost like a tinge of inauthenticity at times.
Yeah.
And so, but I wonder, have you always been that way? I know you grew up in Lancaster, and I just wonder, like as a kid, like what were you like as a kid growing up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania?
Oh, and so yes, I've always been that way, probably much to my parents' dismay. So, essentially, whatever was in my head was out my mouth, whether it ought to be or not. So, hopefully, I've grown over the years and figured out more filters
Maybe a
at the
little bit of a filter,
maybe,
yeah.
or at least at certain times with certain audiences. But yeah, I have, and I've I'm one of four children. And my parents are now both deceased. I recently lost my mother, and my mother
Oh.
um, was such a strong influence because she was an immigrant, from Ireland. Lost her father at 12, had to leave formal schooling at 14 because of the economic conditions, and then left the country at 17 to create a new life in the United States. And so that sort of, you just got to embrace the discomfort, um,
Mhm.
is a learned thing from her, and then later a taught thing from her, or I say an observed and then later taught. And it is what sort of has helped shape the way I look at my career opportunities. If I get a knot in the pit of my stomach about doing something or taking on a new role that is just a little bit uncomfortable, it's usually the signal to me that it's the thing I ought to do.
That is so interesting, because I do also believe that sort of these visceral reactions, you really do need to pay attention to them, and sometimes it's
Yeah.
a signal of something that you have to lean into a little bit more when you're nervous about something,
Yeah.
and, other times it's sort of like a spark, where it's like, "Oh, I'm gonna go for this," and,
Well,
so,
clearly
yeah, I
you've
think
lived that, right? In starting up businesses and taking the departure.
Yeah, I mean, I've told this story before that starting Avoca back in the late '90s was completely sort of counterintuitive at the
Yeah.
time, given just little kids and
Hmm.
mortgage and being the breadwinner. But I went for a run and I kind of had this idea, and then the idea started to get bigger, and I just had this kind of internal feeling that I had to do this, right?
Yeah.
And so, yes, I am a big believer of sort of trusting your gut and your instincts. And Deirdre, I kind of was reacquainting myself with your long career, and I was sort of blown away by just the diversity in the
Mm.
roles that you've had over many years, both big companies, small companies. The sponsor side, the vendor side. I just wonder, is there for you sort of a through line with all of those different roles, or just something that has driven you to pursue this work that you've been doing in our industry?
Yeah. Probably like many experience early in my career, I wouldn't say there was it was sort of a trip through it. And I was fortunate enough to have opportunities in front of me. And then I had the benefit of mentors or sponsors, but also intentionality once I got my footing and where I wanted to be. But not all of it was planned. And I would
Hmm.
describe, people have over the years, especially early on, it was about a career ladder. It's not a ladder, it's a jungle gym, right? And so sometimes you go sideways, sometimes you go down, you go back up, and you hope to hell you don't fall off. And so, although do have a
Right.
few bruises, but what it became was more once if I was at a point of, wow, this feels really comfortable and safe. So it's not flow, like we're humming along. It's when you get through that and it
Yeah.
starts to feel plateau. It's
Hmm.
about, am I here because I want to be, or am I doing this work because I want to, or am I doing this work because it's become pretty comfortable for me? I can do it fairly easily. even with big challenges. And so, in that regard, I would start to get a little bit restless. The worst thing for me or anyone who's trying to manage or lead me is for me to be bored. And so
Hmm.
I'd start to get these little inklings, and then my network was really what helped. Because if I have these conversations with people, then they're
Oh
like, "Hey,
yeah.
are you aware of, this opportunity over here?" But I'd say, Patty, the intentionality of the diversity was trying to get different perspectives. Right? I
Hmm.
started out in the CRO world. I went to the sponsor
Yeah.
world. And then I wanted to look at, what's this look like for healthcare providers? So, and that was my way of also getting closer to what it looks like for the patient who is willing to
Mm.
participate in clinical trials. I went to, I'd say my sponsor side is small to mid-size. Even in a large company, the R&D part of it was small to mid-size. So
Okay.
I've never been big
Hmm.
pharma. Um,
Hmm.
but then having the site side and having the provider side and then the vendor or service provider really gave me a much better view of what it is we're trying to do with the delivery of drug development. And the most impactful has been working with sites.
That's so interesting because you really have touched on the whole sort of clinical trial ecosystem, right? In all the different roles. And so interesting to me too that it's really the impetus is not sort of like, okay, I've mastered this and I'm going to just keep, driving forward. It's more I've mastered this and now I need to move on to a new challenge,
Mm-hmm.
which, you know, I actually can see a link between what you described with your mother's immigrant journey and your just your influences there. But talk to me a little bit about just your perspective around patients and sites and patient centricity. I know that you've written on this topic,
Mm-hmm.
you've spoken about this topic, and for me, it is one of the areas that I've seen big change since I started back in the day in the 80s of being a CRA and going out to sites and there's been positive change, I
Yeah.
think, but there's also more work to do in that regard. So, what's your perspective?
I'll pick up first on your last statement. There's more work to do, and there always will be. And a lot of that is because it's a dynamic environment of healthcare delivery, as well as then
Yeah,
our industry. So that will always be true. Like you, I started in the 80s, early 90s, really going to sites and seeing
yeah,
firsthand what goes on there as a CRA, and really understanding the criticality of the connection between the provider and the patient, and how much of an impact that makes, especially when clinical trials are conducted in the care setting,
mhm,
which is in comparison to at a standalone clinical trial center, which also has
mhm.
a lot of benefits, but is different than when it's in a primary care or secondary care setting. And so it's really around, how do we try to do what's really hard in improving or disproving a hypothesis about a potential therapy. How do we do that and insert ourselves into the natural care path for a patient and a provider? And the intersection of those two things is not easy. And I think what we spent many of the early years of my career in the industry on was, how do we make them do what we want in our protocol? Right? How do we get them
It's a
to follow it? And, right. And basically force fit.
exactly.
And I
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard that described in that way, but yeah, you're absolutely right.
And I think what we've come to better understand is, it's where we can, it's how do we adapt the protocol to the care setting. And you can't do it on every front, or you no longer have a
Right.
well-controlled trial, right? So that's where I think it's being patient focused, also has to be being site focused, because that's where the delivery of care happens. And the being focused, I think, is different than being centered. And what I mean by that is, when you focus on what's happening in that environment and what's going to be the challenges to our trial, And can we do anything different? That's focusing on an appreciation and an understanding that we need to operate in their world.
Hmm.
And whereas patient focus, especially in the care setting, is intentionally around that specific patient. What's the best delivery of care for that patient? And they
Yeah.
can and should be down to the individual. A trial can't be.
Hmm. So, how does that sort of lead to this whole area of clinical research as a care option? And I know you worked at a Elago. I'm
Mhm.
sure you know Jennifer Byrne. I'm good friends
Yep,
with
that's
Jennifer,
right.
the CEO of Javara, and it's such an interesting and I think exciting area. But how do you think about
Yeah.
um, that area?
It's interesting, Patty, because there's been a lot of talk about is that the right phrase to use, right?
Right. I know
And
Jennifer has said integrated research
yeah,
organization,
yeah.
which I think is probably more apt. But what? Yeah, say
I
more about that.
so what the way I see it is in the optionality of care for a given patient, I think clinical research should show up. It should be something for
Hmm.
them to consider. Obviously, that is very unique to the individual and how they would consider it. But it isn't the same as care because in the clinical care setting, they can customize everything around that specific patient. In
Right.
the clinical trial setting, we can hopefully allow more optionality and flexibility to allow the way in which they follow the protocol to have options, whether it's an at
Hmm.
home or a local facility to do something or the primary clinical trial site, and how we define a site changed over the years. Very different to me than I've got options 1, 2, 3, and 4 for you as a patient, and let's talk
Yeah.
about which one works for you best. I'd love to see participation in a clinical trial amongst those options.
Right.
Does that make
And
sense?
it does make
Okay.
sense. I wonder if you can foresee a future where it's just that's pretty commonplace where you're going in to see your physician and it's just part of what is discussed and in terms of the data and the richness of data that all is going to fuel our progress as well as a clinical trials industry. How far down the lane are we?
Mm,
Do you think that that's
I
coming?
I think we're farther than most people would imagine, or that certainly than we want to be.
Uh-huh.
Um, when you look, and I can't rattle off the statistics, but when you look at some of the studies done on this, on how many physicians or other healthcare providers even themselves understand what clinical trials could offer as an option, or the fact that they are even out there, it's not a high awareness. We have a lot of awareness and education that we have to go through, right? And so even if you do have that hurdle, then trying to
Yeah.
navigate to a trial where you may be qualified is again just too hard right now.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. It shouldn't be, but it
it's
is,
it
right?
shouldn't be. And I'll tell you, I'll get a little personal on it. I My brother-in-law was diagnosed with a glioblastoma a couple of years ago.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. And unfortunately, he followed the statistical pattern, and he died not long ago. And what really broke my heart is I'm in this industry. I have a fantastic network. I understand how it works. And I spent endless hours trying to find a clinical trial that fit his diagnosis, his prognosis, and his
Yeah.
treatment, and was accessible to him in his life, and
Yeah.
was at a burden of participation that he could manage with a wife and young children. And then when I found them, trying to get to the person to talk to about whether or not he could qualify, and that wasn't me direct, that was through his oncologist, etc., was just such a hurdle. And it
Yeah.
never resulted in an option for him, that fit his life and his willingness to participate.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I had a similar experience with a very good friend of mine, whose name was Susan, who also was diagnosed with a glioblastoma. And she and her husband asked me if I would look at the informed consent
Okay.
for a clinical trial, which was, I think, 70 pages long or
Right.
something ridiculous. It was just like, oh my gosh. And they're like, we can't make sense of this, but we figured maybe you can help
Mhm.
us or interpret. And I was like, oh, I kind of need to look things up to
Yeah.
help, to figure this out. But, um, I think I'll never forget this, that Susan participated in the trial. It was extremely rigorous. I mean, weekly, multiple blood draws. I mean, sadly, she passed away
I'm
after a
so sorry.
year.
Yeah.
And, her husband said to me, do you think that it was worth it? Like all of the efforts to participate in that trial, do you think it makes a difference for other patients?
Hmm.
And I said to him, Mark, yes. I said, her participation it was so important
Right.
for advancing the knowledge and the disease, and hopefully it'll help others. But when I left him, and I got into the car, I thought, gosh, I hope so,
Mm.
because it, you know, it really comes down to sort of how um, pharma companies, how researchers utilize that data, the
Right.
integrity in which they're applying, just good practices. There's so many things that can go wrong
That's
in a
right.
clinical trial, and I thought, I hope so. No, so you said something earlier about just the optionality and um, just the adapting for the site, for the
Hmm.
patient, whether it be um, bringing the patient to their home, or bringing this study to a patient's home, or providing some flexibility. Do you think the optionality is really one of the biggest challenges right now in terms of sort of just launching a large clinical trial that requires lots of patients? There's sort of this, in some ways, it's a challenge because consistency is
Yep.
what is a driver in protocols. So how do you think about that?
So I hear two different questions there. Is it one of the biggest challenges in launching a large trial? It is, but there's so many. But the
Yeah,
consistency question, I think there's an opportunity and has been realized by many companies about how you get through that variability of data, right? Um, and some of it, I think we can't, not all data are equal. And so what are your primary endpoints? What makes or breaks your analysis? Those are the ones we have to be most consistent and careful on. But there's also some that are, some data we collect routinely for very important safety backgrounds, but let's call it vitals. And if you're not actually doing a study on your blood pressure or that has an effect on your
right.
weight or your height or et cetera, it's still important to be consistent and absolutely rigorous. But what are you relying on those data for? Because when you think about how, again, if you go back to clinical care, how that happens, we all accept treatment options and trust in the healthcare providers based on the way they collect our data and the data they find.
True.
And
Yes.
that's what the majority of the population are experiencing. They're not experiencing clinical trials. And so it's considered quite reliable there. And we know
Yeah.
there's variability in that. And so we have to, I think, really be thoughtful about where it truly matters. And of course,
Hmm.
it all has to be done in a way that's GXP compliant. But I think with technology, with a number of different approaches and statistical modeling, we could probably get through a lot of that. Not
Yeah.
in every
Yeah.
case, not in
Right.
every type of measurement, but a lot of it we can.
Yeah. Deirdre, I wanted to just ask you about just the experiences that you've had working on both sides, both the sponsor side and
Hmm.
the CRO side. And it's been a topic of conversation in some of my podcast interviews, just how the CRO industry has evolved from the early days and how sponsor CRO relationships have
Yeah.
changed and evolved, and in some ways, stayed the same in
Right.
certain
Yeah.
respects.
In a lot of
But
ways. Yeah.
yeah, so and it's been sort of a topic that's been near and dear to my heart because I've spent so much of my career just in this intersection, right,
Yeah.
between sponsors and vendors and just helping to drive improvements. And I wonder, is there a way that you could characterize the state of the industry now between sponsors and CROs and how, CROs experience and technology is being leveraged by pharma companies? You know,
Yeah.
talk to me about that a little bit.
Yeah, look, and this all comes from my personal beliefs, observations, or interpretations of it. But I do think the CRO industry is where I started my career in the early late 80s, early 90s, and it was a reflection of pharma, right? So where pharma had bureaucracy and infrastructure, so did the CRO, and depending on the size and scale, that could
Yeah,
vary, right? Um, but when I sit in a sponsored company and not a large pharma, so I've worked in companies that we might be right, have been conducting like 5 trials, right, up to maybe 60, but not hundreds and
yeah,
hundreds. Um, it's an understandable trepidation we have in handing over work, right? So it's still our regulatory obligation, it's our product, and the reality of the models that have been explored, I think, of what were risk sharing, et cetera, between CROs
yeah,
and sponsors, is that the risk and the benefit isn't spread equally, right? If a trial fails based on conduct, and the CRO and the sponsor will both have a hand in that, it is never one party's, complete
agree.
fault. Um, the CRO will have lost business and a contract. And if the sponsor believes it was more their responsibility than their own, they may never get business again, let's say. On the sponsor side of it, we've lost a major asset and a revenue stream is the funding for future R&D, right? So
Yeah,
the impact of that is huge. Now, the flip side, if it's successful, we might have a model where we're offering a CRO an incentive payment, some sort of benefit in that success will never be at the magnitude of the sponsor if it's a wildly successful product. So I think
right.
that dynamic just has to be appreciated, and most people know it, but don't bring it into the
Yeah,
forefront
I'm
in
I'm actually
conversation.
glad that are shining a light on that because I don't think it's talked about that
No,
often. Just that there's talk about partnership, but you're actually putting partners together that have two very different business models,
right.
right? And so trying to find that intersection of risk and reward, and yeah,
It's
it is
hard.
somewhat fraught. It's
Yeah.
fraught.
And if we have
Yeah.
misalignment of expectations, let alone motivators, that that's challenging. And look, a little anecdote from earlier in my career when I was responsible for all of the outsourcing in a company. Um, I was getting what I would characterize as badgered from the business development person of a CRO that we had selected, right?
Uh-huh.
Of to sign
Yeah.
the contract. And they're, why aren't we signing? And every day I'd get this ping. And I'm like, you've got the award. Calm down. We want to
Yeah.
work through things. We're
Yeah.
methodically getting through and
Right.
partly bureaucratically getting through a contract. And it was creating this horrible tension between the teams. And finally, I got on the phone with the person. I was like, what are you doing? Like, you're going to destroy this relationship before it gets started.
Yeah.
And it was finally out of that moment that he said, we want to book it before the end of the quarter because it makes a difference to us. It didn't make a difference to us, to the sponsor that we signed,
Right,
but
right.
like the next
Yeah.
day would have been fine. But for them, it had this whole economic value that mattered whether it was the 31st of one month or the first of the next. And I was like,
Hmm.
we didn't talk. Why didn't you tell me that? Right.
Yeah,
And
right.
because if we can align, like for them to, for me to be successful as a sponsor, I need them to be successful. And we don't often, now in strategic partnerships, that conversation happens better. In a more sort of
Hmm.
one-off study or transactional outsourcing, I think it doesn't come into the conversation enough.
I agree. I think that it sometimes doesn't even enter the consciousness of the the pharma company or the,
Right.
the
Yeah.
sponsor to sort of, yeah. Yeah, early days, I want to say, gosh, maybe mid 2000s, we started flipping from just doing research at Avoca to find out what pharma companies thought of their CRO partners to sort of
Yeah.
recommending, hey,
Yeah.
how about we do sort of bi-directional so
Yeah.
that we give you feedback, pharma company, on what your CRO partners think of you.
That's
And
right.
it hadn't been done, I guess, maybe it was done, but it seemed like uncommon at the time. And I remember sitting in the office. It was a European company. I was meeting with a very senior person, and he said, "Patty, why should I care what they think of us?" He said, "We're paying the bills, and they just need to show up and do a really good job." So, and I thought, "Oh, okay, wow."
Yeah.
Um, but, I think that has evolved, obviously, and
Yes. Yeah.
we did end up doing quite a bit of bidirectional, research, which was very eye-opening, and I think what often happened was there sometimes is a knee-jerk reaction of, companies not doing well, move on, let's go to somebody else,
Yeah.
but when there's a self-assessment, sometimes what shows up is that the pharma company, maybe didn't set expectations properly. They've
Yeah.
never
That's, yeah.
really managed a outsourced trial of this magnitude. So there were issues on their end in terms of training
Yep.
and tools and that type of thing. And so I think having sort of that sort of balanced perspective, I think, is very important with these outsourced trials.
And I think
Um,
one of the things you said there is what I think is at the heart of it, and it's that understanding expectations. So if you've ever been, have you ever used the methodology of after action review?
oh yeah, yeah, I
Yeah,
know.
right. So the
For a minute.
before action
Yes,
review approach is
yes,
really the place to start, which is let's talk very openly about what are the expectations of what we're about to go through, be it a process, a program, a study, or a relationship for really delivering the totality of a clinical development program. More time spent there and then checking in after certain events or milestones of an after action discipline should help keep the team aligned.
yeah, and in some ways, it's the fundamentals, right?
That, oh,
It's just good
mm-hmm.
communication.
Yeah,
It's
it's good
not
hygiene.
ne- it's not necessarily rocket science, but um, we're kind of closing in on time, but I did
Yeah.
want to ask you about your perspective on just innovation and tech enablement of the clinical trial process,
Mhm.
and really um, kind of where you see us as an industry in terms of adopting new ways of working, and what's the opportunity, but what's also potentially holding us back?
Yeah, and I think the other question is what's the real value versus the novel shiny, attraction,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
look, I'm all for tech enablement. I think we need to do it, but it's not the panacea. It's not solving everything. I think we as an industry are pretty slow to adopt. You and I were both probably working when EDC first was
Oh,
introduced,
yes.
right?
Yeah.
You don't have to do those carbon NCR forms anymore. Probably some of your
Right.
audience won't even know what that is, but right. So the old
We'll put a footnote with the
that's
podcast.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the dinosaur that I feel like sometimes, but that
I'm right with you.
it's really great that we don't have to do that because it speeds
Right.
the delivery of our outcomes, right? You don't have to wait for days for data entry, etc. But what we've done is shifted the work to someone else. So it was great as a sponsor, even as a CRO. That's great.
Yeah.
But now the site's doing our data entry, really, right? Through
True.
all the
Yeah.
EDC. And we have to watch, that's a watch out on all the tech. Because as more and more technology was getting introduced into trials, be it eCOA or whatever device fill in the blank was handed over to them, the site then also had to become the tech help in many ways. Right.
Right.
And so
Right.
the value proposition is certainly something it has to be shared value. So, and this will be heresy. Sometimes paper's just as good. That
Yes.
doesn't mean we always want to use it, but as a
Right.
technology, by the way, it's tried and true. But
Yeah.
what I really mean there is it shouldn't be done because it's a fancy new thing. It should be done because it will expedite things. We can increase quality, consistency, validity of the data. All of that is true. What we have to really watch out for is the burden we're putting on sites and the burden we're putting on patients. And in the
Yeah.
end, look at, does that value proposition get us what I think you mentioned earlier in our conversation is the big, hairy problem we have, which is enrollment. Getting the awareness and
Hmm.
getting patients connected to the right trial, getting the right patients in at the right time, and then having a way to ensure that their participation until the important outcomes against which the whole thing is measured are collected. And so I don't think we've got that balance right. I think we've got a lot of tech coming out and it's spoken about like it's going to solve everything and it's going to solve a lot of things, but it's not the only thing that we need.
Right. And, in my last conversation that I had with Ken Getz, we were talking about just some of the tough data on how long it takes in our industry
Yes.
to adopt things that are, pretty straightforward. Even like EDC, it
Right.
took decades
It took
for there to be
decades.
full scale
Yeah.
adoption. And
But
yeah.
Patty, I think we have and I'm guilty of it in many ways too. It's like, I don't want to be the first. Yeah, that sounds like a really great idea,
Oh,
but
yes.
not on mine, right?
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
also have to be thoughtful about which trials, in which context we try something new.
Hmm.
Um, and anyone who says, but the regulators, they should stop. They're doing it themselves. They're using AI, automation, whatever, fill in the blank technology. And they are there to help us embed it. They're not there to stop us. But the same data quality requirements remain.
Yes, I think sometimes, speaking of regulators, there's almost um, an overinterpretation of regulations.
Hmm.
There's a conservatism, companies who are very conservative because they don't think regulators are going to accept new ways of working, and
Yeah.
we try to um, kind of debunk some of that, especially with some of the work that we're doing, because I think that does slow down our progress at
Yeah.
times. And but to your point of companies not wanting to be first, yes, we've seen that a lot. I was invited to open up a hackathon of one of our
Mm.
clients the other day, and the interesting thing is that 10 years ago, this same company um, basically wrote us a check when I was at Avoca as an early adopter to help get our Diligent platform off the ground.
Oh,
And
great.
one of the points I made at this company's hackathon, which was Sanofi, by the way, was I said, sometimes big pharma, they don't necessarily understand the potential for the impact that they could have,
Yeah.
because a $150,000 check in the big scheme of things was not a big deal for a
Sure.
company like Sanofi. But for a company like ours, it helped to
Yeah.
get a whole tech platform off the ground. And then fast forward 10 years, now we have many, many companies that are benefiting from this. And it's just, so they were an early adopter at a time where there weren't a lot of companies sort of raising their hands saying, hey, put me on this new platform. And so I think that there does need to be small acts of courage at
Yeah.
times
I
to
love that.
sort of dip your toe in the water, try new things for the sake of progress. But it is really, really challenging in
It
our
is,
environment.
and I'll pick up on those small acts of courage and look, I don't work for Sanofi, but I'm going to give a shout out, especially to Vicky DiBiaso, around the courage or the understanding of what the impact, as you said, could have on the industry in that it can accelerate the pace of medicines getting to patients, because
That's what it's about.
and that is what
Yes.
it's about. And I'll go
Yes.
back to like the thing that makes my heart sing is what are we doing for patients? And Vicky and Sanofi started Paladin. And Paladin is an industry and patient advocacy group consortium. And I'd be
Yes.
remiss if I didn't mention them because I am co-chair this year. And it is all for that reason. It's all, how do we accelerate that medicine development in better ways that is available to everybody. It's
Yes.
a closed group, let's call it, only because it's got to have the right voices at the table, but the output is made public on a website for everyone to use. So resources,
That's awesome.
playbooks,
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
And the reason is because we still haven't solved that problem. We're still not going fast enough with clinical trials. We're still not
That's very
getting broad
true.
enough reach. We're still not educating and making people aware of this. And we as pharma have got whole corporate infrastructures, right? And we've got a lot of experience, and we're expecting small patient-run organizations to show up as if they've got that same infrastructure. And so part of this is also helping each other understand those shared expectations. But how do we help those organizations position themselves better to work with pharma, any pharma that is working on products in their space, so that it happens faster? And it happens again with the patient as the ultimate benefactor of that medicine. With their insights, it has to be patient informed. We have to really understand what they're going through
Yeah.
and what matters to them. And when we do that with groups of representatives who truly understand the intersection of the patient and the pharmaceutical industry, we're all going to be better for it. So I
Yeah.
do appreciate those acts of courage that get somebody to start it rolling.
Yeah. And Deirdre, it's a great shout out. And it's probably a great way to close this conversation, which I totally lost track of time because I was so
Me too.
interested in everything you had to say. And so I can't thank you enough. And you're such a superstar. I really appreciate all you do for our industry. And thank you for being part of this podcast today.
I appreciate the invitation. I'm honored to be considered amongst your leaders and legends. And legendary Lucian, I think, is one, maybe you yourself. So thank you for the conversation as well.
Thank you.